Okay, so I would use a board or your bats to build your project on. You don't always have to keep it sitting right on this. But to move your projects around, it's always a good idea to put it on here and then cover it up in plastic when you're done and move it to wherever you want to go. So we do have a bunch of square boards that you can also use. They're just storage boards. They're in that room to the left of the sink. You guys find that all out when you get started. So I just have a variety of tools sitting here. You know, it's my pottery toolkit. I ran a paintbrush and my sponge for cleaning up. You know, you might find that you have to, you end up using one tool the whole time. You know, some people don't use a lot of the tools. I usually use just a few tools, and you'll see the ones that I work with mostly when I get started here. So I'm going to take my wire tool. I'm just going to cut, I don't know, about an inch or so off the top here. And first thing I'm going to do is kind of work this clay a little bit to make it easier to work with. This whole process is called wedging. And basically what I want to do to get the wedging started is I have to kind of pack it down and shape it with my hands a little bit so that it's that kind of a shape. All right. So then to start wedging, what I'm going to do is just wrap my hands around it, and I just kind of lean into it and push forward on it a little bit. And then I roll it back so I can see that flat part again. Push forward on it again. Roll it back. And with a brand new bag of clay, it's usually not super critical that you wedge your clay, for hand building anyways. If you're using any of the class clay or anything that you've recycled yourself, you want to wedge it. The clay can get air bubbles in it, and if you have air bubbles in your clay and you don't get those out, when it goes through the kiln, the bubbles will expand. Air expands as it gets hot. And worst case scenario, it'll make your projects blow up like a grenade. And they can blow up pretty violently, so we want to make sure we're avoiding that. So this is not the best table to wedge on. There's two tables in the other room that have a white surface on them. That white surface is plaster. It's a special kind of plaster that we use in ceramics pretty exclusively, and that's the best place to wedge your clay. So when you're done wedging, though, wherever you do choose to wedge, just make sure you have your sponge handy so that you can always clean up behind yourself. Even if you're going to continue working here, why work on top of a mess, right? Keep cleaning up behind yourself as you go. All right, so the amount of clay you want to start with for this project is just a baseball-sized piece of clay. So obviously this is way bigger than a baseball, right? So I'm just going to take that, I cut my hand and I slap that on the clay. And I'm just going to pat this until it's nice and round. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to do a pinch building project. And pinch building is pretty basic. You know, I mean, we don't exclusively just make this thing pinch building. Pinch building is just literally where you're pinching the clay into some kind of form or shape. I mean, we do more than just pinch the clay and make a bowl or something. But this is how you're going to start it, and this is what we call a project, is pinch building. All right, so I'm going to slice this in half. So I have my knife. Just going to cut it right down the middle. So I have equal halves. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to basically pinch build this into a bowl form. I'm going to stick those two halves together to make a hollow ball. The reason we do that is because anytime you build anything out of clay, the clay can only be, a half an inch thick. 3/8 of an inch is a good number to shoot for. When you start going past, half an inch, you start running the risk of having the clay be too thick. When the clay is too thick, what happens is when we go to dry that clay, it doesn't dry evenly, so the inside core stays wet, and everything around that is trying to dry, and the clay shrinks pretty dramatically as it dries. So if the outside of your clay is trying to shrink and the inside is staying solid, what do you think is going to happen to the outside? It's gonna crack, yeah. It's the worst case scenario. It actually cracks and then all the outside falls off of the inside. So we want to do everything we can to make things hollow. All right, so this is just an easy beginner project for learning how to make something hollow. Okay, so what you're gonna do is just hold that in one hand, take your thumb, kind of push it in there to get a starting point. See that? And then I'm just gonna pinch the clay between my thumb and my fingers. And I'm feeling how thick the clay is as I do this to get, a gauge on how thick the clay is. And I'm also feeling for any bumps in the clay. If I feel any bumps in the clay, that means an air bubble. That means I did get all the air bubbles out of the clay. And usually what you can do is just take your needle tool, which is this one, and if you feel like a bump in it, you can just poke it and then keep pinching the clay and it'll work the air right out of it. So this looks pretty straightforward and pretty simple, and it is, but just like anything else you've never done before, don't be surprised if you have to make a couple attempts at this. Usually what I see happen is students who try to do this for the first time, instead of it being like a half ball kind of shape, it turns into a big flat disc like this. It's totally common. It's not bad if that happens to you. You just take your clay and wedge it back into a ball and start again. Remember, the thing that I love to say in here is that there is absolutely no instant gratification in this class. Things don't just magically appear. It does take some trial and error and a lot of work to figure some of these things out. Okay. All right, so there's one half. So I'm gonna do the same thing over here. Trying to make them the same size. And while you're doing this, you can start to think about maybe things that you want to try and make. So once we get these two halves of this ball together, this ball can be transformed into almost any shape. You can add things to the surface to change it. So there's a lot of different things you can make doing this. All right, so my next step now is I want to combine this piece and this piece. So whenever you attach two pieces of clay together, it's a little bit tricky. The clay, when it's wet, is very sticky. So when I push two pieces of clay together, they magically stay together, right? But as soon as these two pieces dry, they're gonna peel right apart from each other. So if you don't do this next step that I'm showing you, this it's called scoring and slipping. If you don't do that or don't do it adequately, your projects won't stay together. So like if you make some kind of, cartoon character thing from TV and you put some arms and legs on it, and you don't score and slip it, when it dries, the arms and legs are just gonna fall right off. So scoring and slipping, this is where your serrated edge tool comes in. The teeth on this thing scratch through the clay. So this is what it looks like when it's all scored properly. See how scratched up that is? So if you don't use a serrated edge tool to do this, you're not doing it properly. So you have to have one of these. And this tool has a million uses. You'll see me use it for all kinds of stuff. Okay, so remember, you can apply your slip using a container like that if you can find one. Or you can just simply use a paintbrush. Just paint it on there. Okay. Or I can use my slip container. So you don't have to do both halves, but I'm going to use the slip container on this half just to show you what it looks like. It's a lot easier to use. Something like this to put your slip on. So then you put those two halves together, line them up, and then you just gently push the clay together. So now to really make sure this is going to stay together, what I want to do is get rid of this seam. I don't want to be able to see that at all. So I take my wooden tool and I do something that I call stitching, just because it looks like I'm stitching the clay. But what I'm doing is I'm pushing the clay from one side to the other so that the two halves are actually physically mixing together. So I just go all the way around on one side. I'm not digging real deep into the clay. I'm trying not to cut through the clay all the way. I'm just scratching the surface. Just pushing that clay. I flip it over, and I actually will stitch across that now. So you work kind of in phases here, and the first phase is really just kind of your construction phase, where you're getting all your parts together. You're getting your general shape formed. And then later on, you'll let the clay kind of set up a little bit, let it dry just slightly, and then you'll go into a refining stage where you do all your finishing. You know, you make sure that the surfaces are exactly what you want them to look like. All right, so with the serrated edge tool now, I want to refine that even more. So I'm going to take this, I'm going to put a little bend in it with my fingers like that. I'm going to drag that through the clay. And the cool thing that the serrated edge tool does is that it plows through the clay and it redistributes the clay so that you get a much more consistent surface. So the trick to making this thing work really well is if you work this in many different directions. And so over here, you see how I have all these bumps and stuff on there? That's from the building process. I wouldn't normally do this at this stage. I would probably do this more when I get to the refining stage, just to show you what it does. See how it starts to make those bumps level out? And I'm not scraping away a whole bunch of clay. I'm just resurfacing this. So generally when I'm building stuff, if I'm doing like a pinch building project like this, I will actually take my serrated edge tool and I'll go over the whole thing like this and just get the surface nice and consistent. And that's just the way I work. It's not right, it's not wrong. You know, it's just what I like to do. I like to start with a nice round shape and then go from there. So let's say you get to this point right here and you look at the clock and you think to yourself, oh, I better get cleaned up and get to class. What do you think you should do? Put it in a plastic bag. That's right, you remembered that from the other day. Good memory. So if you get to a point like right here, you know, obviously it's not done, but you run out of time to do lab hours, you just wrap it up in a plastic bag, put it on your shelf, and then come back to it at a later time. Okay? Yeah?
Will that blow up?
It will. I have a step that I'm going to do later on. That's a very good question, though. That's an awesome observation. Most people don't even question that, even though I already talked about the air bubble thing. So what I can do from here now, and did you guys hear his question? He asked me if this would blow up, and it definitely would. If I left it like this thing would go off like a grenade in the kiln, and it would send shrapnel all over the inside of the kiln and probably break other people's projects. So eventually what I will end up doing is I will take my needle tool and I'll poke a hole through this and create a vent hole, so that when this starts heating up and the air inside of it starts to heat up, the air can escape out through that vent hole. It relieves the pressure. Does that make sense, everybody? Okay. So if you have something that you build that has multiple chambers on it, all those chambers have to be tied together so that all the air vents out. Either that or you have to have a vent hole into each individual chamber that you create. Okay. So let's do something simple with this. what you can do is you can start shaping it. And I just generally use my hands, kind of like a paddle. And if you're patient, and you're not like, you know, trying to smash it all together, it will start to change shape. Now, one of the things that will happen is that you sometimes will have that seam start to pop back open again. You see that? Okay. And that's because the slip I put in there has not set up yet. So it's still, those two pieces can still slide past each other. And that's not a big deal. All you have to do is just take this tool and just stitch over that again. You just got to be observant so that if that does start to happen, you fix it right away so that it doesn't get out of control. Because if it opens up too much, it's going to be really hard to fix. Okay, I can see it starting to do it there too, so I'm just going to preemptively hit that spot. Once you stop changing the shape of this too much, that seam will stop trying to move around on you. So there are also some other tools in the classroom that you can use. There's a box up there to the right of the sink that has a bunch of rulers and straight edges and some paddles and things in it. So like you can use paddles like this to work the shape. And it is a bit time consuming, but you just have to be patient and get it the shape that you want it to be. Alright, so let's say I wanted to add some stuff to this. You know, maybe I want this to look more elongated. I can take another chunk of clay. Just going to make this round. I can poke my thumb in there, and I can pinch this into another hollow form, and I can add more clay onto this. So you can think about whatever it is that you're trying to make as almost like geometric shapes. Create those shapes and then score it and slip it and put it all together. So what I'm trying to do is make kind of an elongated top on this. So if I just play with the clay and keep working it, start to squeeze that clay into the shape that I want. As long as I'm careful not to trap any air in there, I can push my finger in there and change the shape. I can keep pinching it into the shape that I want. And it doesn't have to be perfect right now. Once I add it to this, I can start to continue to shape it more. Did it shut off? Really? I'll let it go until it dies. I guess I will be making a different one. So it got too wide on me, so I'm actually just compressing the clay back in. On here, I'm going to score it and slip it on there. Make sure this is all scored well. And then I want this airspace in here to be connected to the one that's in here. So it's just a matter of poking some holes right there. Attach that on there. doesn't look like much yet, but as I work this, you know, I can start to visualize what it could be. And I just keep working it until it gets closer and closer to what it is that I'm trying to make. And one of the things you're going to see is that in the amount of time I have to work with you today, you're not going to see a complete project get built. The refining takes a long time. You know, so I'll get the basic parts together, but I'm not going to get the whole thing done in one go. This side. I have a go-to that I make all the time when I'm doing this pitch building project, usually. See if you can figure it out what it is. A gnome. Did someone warn you? Well, that means I'm on the right track then, because that's the perfect guess. So I pushed in on the sides to start creating kind of a beard shape on there. See how it's starting to come together? Now he needs a face, so I gotta figure out where I'm gonna put his face. You know, sometimes I'll go as far as, you know, let's see here, maybe I'll put his mouth right there, maybe his eyes will go in there somewhere, nose right there. And if I'm doing this and I find that it's not looking right, I can always take these things back off. The clay will just come right off. You know, you can pull it off, or you can use your little knife and chop it off. Last quarter I was trying to make a little kind of cartoony, funny version of Chewbacca, and I could not get his face right. Every time I did it, it would come out looking like something completely other than Chewbacca. Everything else on it looked like Chewbacca, but the face was always wrong. I think I cut his head off like 3 or 4 times before I got it right. So there's nothing wrong with erasing what you have and starting over. I'm just going to get the basic parts in place, and then in future classes I'll continue to show this to you as I work on it, you know, and talk to you about how I did what I did to finish it. Make some eyeballs. So there are some things you want to avoid when you're working on this. The clay does not like to be thin little pieces. So a good example of that is a student a long time ago tried to make a puffer fish, and she created this round form that was the fish's body, and then she was making all these really long spikes that looked kind of like this, and she was sticking those all over it, and I kept telling her that there's no way that's going to work. These things are going to dry really fast, they're going to be really, really delicate, and they're going to break off. And you know, even before they started to dry, she broke half of them off when she went to put the plastic bag over it. So the solution is she took all those long skinny spikes off, and she made some little short fat ones like this, so that it has more surface area to connect onto. And then because it's not a long skinny piece like this, it's not going to dry out really fast, so it stays on there a lot easier. Okay, so like if you're making some kind of cartoon character or something, and it's got long skinny arms or long skinny legs, those things won't work unless you figure out a way to have the arms attached, you know, like in more than one spot. Like, so if I was going to put arms on him, I'd have them probably attached here and here. As far as legs go, you can't make things like this stand up on skinny little legs like that. That just absolutely will not work. Okay, so you have to figure out how to make the legs big and stable if you want to put legs on something. All right, so let me see here. Figure out where his hat's gonna go. Put his hat on there next. So one of the things that I always try to do is to define different sections of whatever it is I'm trying to sculpt. Like for example, if I was making a turtle shell, or like how I added the head on here, if I made a turtle and I made the body, I wouldn't make a whole separate shell and clunk it down on top of the body that I already created, because that would create a giant air pocket inside there, and that would not survive. Plus, it would make the clay so thick that it might take forever to dry. So like the way that I do it with something like this, or even a turtle shell, is I roll out a piece of clay like that. I'm going to store that. Put some slip on there. Put that on there, and then to make it look like the bottom of his hat, what I'm going to do is I'm going to blend the top half of that coil in. I use my serrated edge tool to refine that even more. And then I'll just basically use my fingers to really make it look right. So once I get that on there, what you're going to see is that by adding that little bit on there, it makes it look like this whole piece is a completely separate piece that was plopped on top. I mean, it kind of was, but by adding that on there, it defines it, makes it a separate piece. Does that make sense? So you could use that concept for a lot of different things. You know, like the turtle shell. A lot of people like to make turtles because it's kind of an easy form for your first try at this. Okay. So, you know, let's say I wanted to add, let's put like a ring around the bottom to kind of define like where the coat might be, his coat, or a shirt or something. That'll probably be out of time. So you can tell by how much I've accomplished in the 50 minutes that I have that this is not a project you're going to get done in one sitting in here. This is going to take multiple times visiting the lab to get it done. And that's pretty much how it's going to be for all your projects. It'll take you guys longer to work on these things than it does me, obviously, because you've never done this before. So remember to be patient with yourselves. Remember that it's not going to just magically turn into something. You know, it's a pretty frequent occurrence where I see students have to start all over from scratch. You know, just because what they're making is just not turning out, and they learn from that experience and they call it practice. They start a new one, okay? And that's okay. starting to come out. So it's a very long ways from done. I got a lot more work to do on it. As I'm working on this, sometimes the best thing that I can do is I can set it down and I can walk away from it for a little while. That lets the clay kind of dry up a little bit, just a little bit, so that the clay is firmer and easier to work with. And sometimes, if you're getting frustrated with something, walking away from it's the best thing you can do. Just take a little break. But yeah, it's not a bad idea to just play around a little bit, and don't worry about it being your final thing. You only have to make one of these projects. This is your pitch building assignment. You just have to do one. But sometimes the piece of clay you start with is not the piece of clay you finish with. Does that make sense to everybody? Okay. All right, so what can you and can't you make? Well, we want to make sure that we're making things that are sculptural. We want to avoid making things that are offensive, obviously. Hopefully you're all smart enough to know that. You want to make things that transform that ball that you initially make into something else. I don't want to see baseballs and volleyballs and footballs and golf balls. That's just a ball. That's easy. And I want you to raise the difficulty level here a little bit. So I want to see a transformation of that initial ball that you create, whether that means adding more stuff to the surface or dramatically changing the shape of that ball into something else. Okay. I always make silly little garden gnomes. I think they're fun to make, and I think they're kind of easy to make. But you can make anything you want to, really. We're not making utilitarian objects, though. So I don't want you making like a functional teapot. I don't want you to make a little pitcher. I don't want you making coffee mugs. That's all stuff we'll make later. Right now, I want you to just play around and make something fun, a little fun sculpture of some kind. Okay? Does anybody have any questions about this project? Okay, so try to have this built. Give yourself a week or two to work on it. Don't try to take on too much that it ends up taking you, half the quarter to do this one project, because we got a lot of other things to learn. So stick to trying to get these things done within a week, 2 weeks at the most. Okay. So I think I put on your calendar that I wanted this one done like in 2 weeks, something like that. Just look at your calendars. All right. Okay. If you don't have any questions, that's the demo. If you didn't get into a locker, I know some of you guys came in a little late, make sure you find some people to share a locker with and get signed up for a locker somewhere in the room so you have some place to keep all your stuff. Okay? And if anybody wants to start doing lab hours, you can pick a spot and get set up and get started, and I'm here to help you.